Okay, so my book is called Peace Weavers Uniting the Salish Coast Through Cross-Cultural Marriages. See my sticker I have on it now?
Oh, yeah.
Prize-winning sticker.
Yeah.
So I made a really giant copy. The cover was done by Steve Mayo of Bellingham, the eminent marine artist. And it portrays the arrival of the white folks from a different angle. Usually we see a giant ship in the foreground, and then the Indians are kind of accessories way back in the back. So Steve has reversed this because our perspective, and mine that I like to change people's idea of, is that us white folks did not move into an empty wilderness, and that's what we've always been fed. But this wasn't. It was a neighborhood where everything already had a name. There were lots of residents, and what we would call towns. They had villages, but it was not an empty place. So I worked 18 years on this before this book came out, and now 2 years later, the second volume of biographies will come out. It'll be called Interwoven Lives. And these biographies are of the native women in this area who married county officials and military officers and other settlers in the earliest years of Whatcom County. There's a saying, historians are always surprised that their subject waited for them. And I found mine while I was a volunteer research assistant at the Washington State Archives for 15 years. So I would help people do genealogy or academic projects, or I even helped an artist work on designing belt buckles. So, but when our county histories were written, and this book centers on Whatcom County, although it has much larger implications. But when our early histories were written here in Whatcom County, these women who were important women of accomplishment were simply written out all over the West in favor of the 5 nice white ladies who are now listed as the first woman in town. Well, they weren't the first women in town. They were some of the first women in town, but the rest of them were Native Americans. So this is the way my book begins. Mary, a Coast Salish woman, slept beside her second husband, Chief Henry Quina, in the darkness of a December morning in 1890 on Lummi Reservation in the northwest corner of Washington State. Not far away, her daughter Teresa Forsyth Finkbonner, along with her husband and 5 children, slumbered before the sunrise would wake them. 1,000 miles east, at Wounded Knee Creek in South Dakota, Colonel James Forsyth stood on a rise in the frigid winter morning and watched as fire from 4 Hotchkiss mountain guns raked across the teepees of exhausted Sioux families below. It cut to pieces starving men, women, and children. Terrified mothers ran and crawled away with their little ones to seek shelter in ravines where scores died of wounds or froze to death in the following hours. When past historians scrutinized Forsyth's actions, their assessment of his character would have been better informed and perhaps more nuanced had they known about Mary and Teresa. The abandonment of his first family remained hidden for more than a century, except to Mary's descendants and local residents. How many of you are familiar with the Finkbonner name in Whatcom County? It's a very large family that Teresa founded with her husband. Did you also know that Henry Roeder and Russell Peabody, who came and were the first people on Bellingham Bay, the first white folks to settle there, that they both had native wives? Russell Peabody's wife eventually went home to Sumas, Lake Sumas, where her original village was. Henry Roeder, this is the first time anybody's ever read about Henry Roeder. When his fiancée from Ohio was coming, then he packed his Lummi wife and 2 children off to Lummi Reservation. And there's different stories about whether they died there or did not die there. But this secret was kept for 150 years. I found it in the files of Howard Buswell, a local historian who collected things for 40 years, intending to write a book on the lower Nooksack River and Lummi Reservation, and then he died and didn't write it. But the files are all still here for us to use, and he was coding Roeder's name because he was afraid of Roeder's family, but by going through and finally figuring this out, I found like 4 eyewitnesses that I could establish that this really did happen. So the context of what happened here in Whatcom County, it was not unusual. 80% of our married couples for the first 20 years of Whatcom County's existence, 80% were cross-cultural couples. And that's Whatcom County at that time was Whatcom, Skagit, and San Juan were all together called Whatcom. So 20 years ago, I started off with 22 of these wives that I was going to write about, and I kept winnowing it down based on the information I could find about them and their husband. And so I went 22, 16, 12, 10, and I finally wrote 8 biographies, 4 in Peace Weavers, and 4 will come out in March. This began with the Spanish, and as soon as the Spanish hit the New World, these cross-cultural marriages began. Sometimes they were by force, and sometimes they were not. Sometimes they were long marriages, sometimes they were short marriages. In the 1700s, Thomas Jefferson and Patrick Henry had this idea that if we were ever to be an American ethnicity, that it would necessitate the colonists intermarrying with the Native Americans. It was a good idea, but it didn't go over well. And the reason was that the white folks were willing to adopt technological things and to learn about growing corn and squash and all those other things. But they didn't want to adopt anything of the Native American worldview or spirituality. On the other side, the Native people figured out pretty quickly that no matter how much they changed or adopted white culture, they would never be completely equal. And so what happened was the sons of some of these early mixed marriages then became leaders of the early rebellions. Corn Planter of the Seneca, Joseph Brant of the Mohawk, Alex McGillivray of the Creek, Osceola of the Seminole, all were from cross-cultural families. As the settlers then moved across the Appalachians, what they found were communities that were already cross-cultural. St. Louis, Detroit, Chicago, Green Bay and Prairie du Chien in Wisconsin, Arkansas Post, San Antonio, Santa Fe. Those were all founded by mixed families. As the settlers continued to move west and found communities beyond the Mississippi, and those communities grow, and they start writing their own histories. And so we begin to build the myth of the pioneer woman in both literature and later on movies and all kinds of other things, and especially in community histories. And these crossed out these Native American women who had helped to build these new communities. So what we get now is she was a courageous, sad-eyed wife or widow who left her home forever and walked beside a covered wagon across the continent to settle in a wilderness that with her womanly efforts became a real community. Or she was half of an improbable love story, the mail-order bride who braved the ocean's dangers to marry a virtual stranger and with him build a community. Or she was the school marm who brought culture to a dusty town. Perhaps she never married and dedicated her life to the town's children. Or she was the business-minded, satin and lace-clad saloon girl with a heart of gold whose for sale femininity kept a settlement in the wilderness from devolving into violence and lawlessness until real ladies arrived. Standing pugnaciously alone were Calamity Jane and Annie Oakley, symbols of fierce femininity equal to men in the face of the West's challenges. Not memorialized were the young indigenous women who lived where forts were built and settlers staked claims that displaced native communities. High-born native daughters sometimes wed army officers, merchants, and local officials whom the families considered of equal social status. The women played their own roles on a frontier that was cultural and not geographic. So then we get to the Northwest, and so you've got the Oregon Trail people coming into the Willamette Valley, and we've always been presented that the Willamette Valley was pretty much empty, open for settlement. But when they rolled into it, there were already towns there that had been settled by Hudson Bay Company men and their native wives. In 1843, with that original Oregon Trail party, the people of St. Paul were busy building their first brick church to be the first brick building north of San Francisco. So definitely not empty. North of the Columbia River, up where Washington was founded, then we get Fort Vancouver, Walla Walla, Colville, Chewelah, Okanagan, Spokane, Missoula, Montana, Wenatchee, Bellingham, and someone just contacted me and said that at one time there was a little settlement down there at Bow, down the freeway, that was settled by mixed families also. And I just met at a conference, a woman said Deer Lodge, Montana is another. I think they're all over the place, but we just have never heard of them. So Whatcom County comes into being after Roeder and Peabody arrive in December of 1852 and decide to do a mill and get permission from Lummi leaders to build a mill at Whatcom Falls. Then over the next 5 years, we get 4 groups of bachelors flooding into our area, and it makes Bellingham Bay area very unique among towns. First, you get the mill workers, 1853. 1854, the coal mine at Seaholm starts, so we get a whole bunch more bachelors coming in. 1856, the Army comes to protect the Lummi and the settlers, not to be adversarial, but to protect them from northern raiders who come down from Canada. So they bring more guys. 2 years later, we have the Fraser River Gold Rush, and we have 10,000 guys camped on the beach all summer long. Most of them left, but there's in each of these groups, there's a percentage that decided to settle in Whatcom County. Most of them were about 30, and I think that they had realized they weren't going home with a big fortune, which they would flash around back in Ohio or someplace, and decided to settle down. The land here was good, the economics looked promising, and they all married the neighborhood girls. And there were no eligible white women here at that time at all. There were married women and there were babies. That was it. So they married the neighborhood girls, which were Lummi, Samish, Swinomish, Nooksack, and some from some other areas. So the 4 women that are in here. Caroline Davis Cavanaugh, married to fulfill her father's agenda to keep peace among the alien peoples who shared geographical space. Her tenacity allowed her family to keep part of her own Samish family's traditional inherited land. Caroline's first husband was the nephew of Jefferson Davis, the Confederate president. And when the Civil War started, he planned to stay here. They already had a farm down on March Point in Skagit County and a son. And he tried to stay, and then the family came after him and said, you got to come home and fight for the family down there in Mississippi. So he left, and spent most of the war in a prisoner of war camp, which I got to see the records for that, and died. And when she found out that he was actually dead, then she married the county sheriff, who was an Irish guy. So her chapter is this: Caroline, the widow who wasn't. Caroline Cavanaugh, one of Skagit County's founding mothers, walked slowly along the 6 miles of country road between Swinomish Reservation's Catholic Church and her aged cedar cabin on Shea School, now called March Point. Caroline's brown skin was deeply wrinkled, but her eyes still shone. She had spent nearly her entire life on the 3-mile-long peninsula south of Bellingham Bay, her homeland, her Illahee. Shea School held the story of her childhood, most of her married life with 2 men, and 30 years of widowhood. In the distance, she saw a motorcycle roaring toward her, dust clouds billowing. The young rider easily recognized the tiny woman whose long wavy hair reached almost to the ground when it wasn't in her usual braid. Even in old age, her lifelong pride was still not fully gray. U.S. Navy sailor Lyman Cavanaugh braked his new machine to a dusty halt and greeted his beloved grandmother. He kidded the famously independent woman. "Grandma, don't you want a ride?" Everyone knew how Caroline would bristle and reject offers of assistance. The little woman surprised her grandson when she gathered her long skirt and climbed up behind him without hesitation. Caroline relished her ride home, hair flowing behind, brushed by the wind. The second woman, second biography, is Mary Fitzhugh Lear Phillips. She lived her life in accordance with the Sklallam people's self-identification of the strong people. Her resilience and survival skills enabled her descendants to become leaders in a new century. And Chief Salish James, used to be Bill James of the Lummi, is a descendant of Mary, as are many other talented leaders at Lummi. Okay, so her chapter begins like this: Mary, daughter of the strong people. The springless wagon creaked and moaned through muddy ruts and over rocks in the crude approach road to Washington Territory's new prison. Rough-looking men in dirty suits and dirtier boots swung the gates open, and the wagon rolled through the unfinished stockade that smelled of newly cut logs. The horses halted before the 2-story prison building whose glassless windows stared at the wagon's occupants. Mary Phillips struggled down from the wagon, hampered by iron manacles. Convicted of killing her alcoholic and abusive 4th husband on Christmas Day 9 months earlier, she would call the prison home for the next 2 years. Though the prison confined no other women prisoners, nor had even a single female guard, Mary was not alone. Also in the wagon were Mary's infant son and 3-year-old daughter. Prison records called the little ones boarders, but in fact they would also be prisoners in the brutal institution. And the third woman is one that you might be more familiar with, having her husband and her helped get the Methodist mission for the Nooksacks built up here in the early days. Clara Tennant Selhamitam helped to build new communities through church building. She exhibited leadership that took her family's values of service and obligation into a blended culture without losing her own identity. Her chapter is called Clara, A Life in 4 Acts. Clara and Reverend John Tennant climbed into a large cedar canoe at the crossing, site of the Nooksack Methodist Mission at today's Everson, Washington. Nooksack headman Lyndon Jim Selhamitam Yellowcanum captained the 8-man crew who would take them, 2 other ministers, and his own family downriver after the Methodist camp meeting. The canoe ran low and heavy. Though melting Mount Baker snow filled the Nooksack River almost to the top of its banks, the tenants' journey was pleasant. The river's currents, logs, root balls, and boulders always lurked in new spots, but the Nooksack people had canoed the river for centuries. Near Jim's village and the young town of Linden, they fought through the narrow channel at century-old Devil's Bend logjam. They fiercely pulled through the large whirlpool beyond, but on that day, an enormous snag, lodged across the current, could not be seen beneath the swift water's surface, just past the maelstrom. The canoe's prow ran up on the submerged log and lurched high out of the water. The men struggled to control the craft, whose stern caught in the whirlpool, but it swung over the middle of the roiling water. Caught, the canoe turned until its full length struck the log. It split in two. The passengers screamed as the wounded canoe tilted up, turned back, and capsized. Everyone went into the glacial water. The whirlpool sucked passengers in the stern underwater and carried them choking downstream. Clara and John clung to one half of the drifting canoe. When he spotted a snag floating in an eddy, he shoved Clara toward it. She clung to the log, but her heavy clothes dragged her deeper into the frigid water. The Nooksack crew had reached the bank, but several jumped back in to rescue her. John fought the current until he grabbed another snag far downstream. Lyndon Jim and his granddaughter surfaced, flung together across the submerged log. He held tightly to the little girl, but the relentless river tore her away and left him holding only a piece of her dress. Her mother, Mariah, struggled ashore with the baby, but went back into the river for hours, searching for her lost daughter. Hypothermic, exhausted, and frantic with grief when they found the girl's body under a drift of logs, Mariah did not long survive. The Nooksacks, tenants, and others mourned the victims in the Selhamitan longhouse. So that's the origin of Tennant Lake. You guys know where Tennant Lake is? That's where the Tennant land claim was. They were terrific farmers. And John Tennant was the son of one of the most famous Methodist missionaries that ever came over the Appalachians. His father, Thomas, became part of the reason why the American Methodist Church split into North and South for a number of years over the issue of slavery, and his dad became an abolitionist. And while John was out here during the Civil War, his dad, in his 70s, was hiding in a limestone cave for almost the entire war and still managed to come out alive. That astounds me. People were tough. Nellie Carr Lane personified the community mother. Through her own actions and those of hundreds of descendants, she contributed to Lummi Island's community development and Lummi Nation's future. And Chief Bill James is also a descendant of Nellie Lane, and there's about 400 Lanes here now, including Dr. Dakota Lane, who has come home from medical school to work, and the one that is a high school basketball star is one of Nellie's descendants, and a lot of other people of accomplishment. So this is called Nellie, an American Family. Jim Carr was dying. With every labored breath, he knew the pneumonia would not be defeated, the fever would not break, the chills would not cease, the coughing would not stop. He was going to die, and his 2 young Stallo wife Nellie and their baby would be alone in the cabin. What happened next became family legend. The dying man told Nellie to get his horse and hurry to Sheriff Fred Lane. "Go get my friend. I want to see him before I die. I want to tell him something." Lane's land claim adjoined Carr's, but the sheriff was often miles away in town, sometimes in the islands. She thought Lane had taken the canoe to his place in town. but she ran down to where she saw his horse tethered. Lane was still there and saw Nellie's distressed face. When he asked what was wrong, she gave him Carr's message. Back at the cabin, Carr told Lane that he was dying and said, "I want you to take good care of my wife and baby." Helene Nellie Carr had no local family. To return to her mother near the Fraser River, demanded that she find someone to canoe her upriver to Squamish, then find a Nooksack escort to take her up the trail into Stalo country. The trip would take days, and it was early 1867. The weather veered from clear and cold to snow and rain. The Arctic winds that funneled down the river to the prairies might come at any time. It was too early in the year for such an arduous journey with a baby. The too young wife became a too young widow. F.F. Lane did not take her home to her family. No one did. Lane married her instead. So, the second book comes out in March. Lane was the son of a really famous sea captain from Massachusetts. Those guys who sailed the fully rigged big ships around the world to China and back. And that was the family he came out of in Annisquam, Massachusetts. So they have their own really fascinating history. And what I did with these biographies was I take a look at what the girl or young woman and her culture and her background is. And I look at the husband, because I know that when you get married, both people bring baggage to the marriage. And you cannot just drop people out of the sky. You have to know what they're carrying along with them into the marriage. So I've gone back 3 and 4 generations sometimes to see what that family was like. And then I talk about the marriage. And most importantly, I talk about the legacy that each woman left behind in Whatcom County with her descendants. So in the new book is Interwoven Lives, Indigenous Mothers of Salish Coast Communities. And those 4 will be Jenny and Tom Wynn, and she was a very elite, lummy young woman, and her husband was a Quaker blacksmith from Philadelphia, from a family whose home was built in 16-something and is now the oldest occupied house in Philadelphia. His ancestor was William Penn's best friend and surgeon. Really interesting family. The second biography is Mary Allen, who was from up the Fraser Canyon. She married Solomon Allen, a farm kid from southern Illinois. And they founded the little burg of Marietta, which is now mostly washed away, but at one time it was a real going deal. The third one is Elizabeth and James Patterson. Elizabeth was the daughter of Pat Canham, the most powerful native leader in western Washington, and controlled all 3 of the passes across the Cascades. Elizabeth married a cattleman from Missouri, and they came to what is now Linden. So they were there before the Judsons with several other families that were also intermarried with Nooksack women, and founded the very first dairy farm in Whatcom County. And the fourth one is Pickett. And the Pickett story of he was Captain Pickett, then he became Confederate General Pickett. But the story of him and his wife and their son is so full of stereotypes and myths. Anything that's out there is almost totally erroneous. So I spent 20 years on this. And she was from Alaska. Their son became a famous artist, and Whatcom Museum owns one of his paintings, and that painting will be on the cover of the book. So, my book, the introduction of it, is the first real, total re-examination of everything that's of Whatcom County's early history that's been done since the 1940s. And so what I felt I needed to do was pick apart everything that was in all the local histories, pick it apart and re-look at it. So Fred Lane was said to have gone to Yale University. He was pretty educated, so I just wrote a letter to Yale University. Nope, never registered at Yale University. On the other hand, we had a guy here who didn't tell anybody he'd been in West Point and got kicked out. So, looking and re-examining all the stuff that's been written and suspending all the assumptions, particularly about the women, that there's not going to be anything out there, which is what we all have believed. These women were married by the guy, then she sits in a corner and she mends clothes and she cooks. And it turns out not to be true at all. They were all women of accomplishment and really interesting people. So, questions?
What's the name of the new book?
The new book will be called Interwoven Lives.
So are you gonna go on to more women than the 8, or are you going on to something else?
I don't think I have another 20 years of brains left. Unfortunately, I am like the world's latest bloomer, because I never did any writing or started a book or anything, and I just kind of fell into writing this because of someone that was a newspaper writer back east was referred to me at the State Archives for help on Pickett's native wife. And when I told her everything that could be found out about her has already been published, she said to me, "Would you please suspend that assumption and look again?" And when I did, I found more. Then I asked myself, well, what about all those other women that everybody says there's nothing out? And I actually had one local historian, a man, say to me, well, you don't think he really loved her, do you? And some of these couples were married for 40 years and had 6 or 8 kids. And, you know, that with just our perspective is just kind of nutty. And 80% of the married couples here were all cross-cultural. So I just sort of fell into it. Howard Buswell had a list of the ones he knew about. So that's why I started with 22 and started winnowing it down. What I'm planning on doing is I went back to the East Coast twice for a month at a time to research the men. And I have enough for 2 more books, but they are biographies. I have enough for 3 more books. They're biographies of the husbands. And I think I'm going to write about Fitzhugh, Mary Fitzhugh, Lear Phillips' husband. She was first married to a native man who died in an epidemic, I believe. Then she was married to E.C. Fitzhugh, the mine manager. Then William King Lear, an entrepreneur and post-settler who eventually founded the town of Wrangell, Alaska. And then the last one was the lime kiln worker that she killed. But Fitzhugh was a blue-blooded Virginian, about as blue-blooded Virginian as you could get. And one of his close cousins was Robert E. Lee's mother. So he was a lawyer as well as mine manager. He was nominated and confirmed for the Territorial Supreme Court while under indictment for murder. So he's just a fascinating guy, and I think probably the weirdest person that ever lived in Washington Territory. So all of that is sitting there waiting for me, so it's kind of nagging, and I think that's what the next book will be. Yeah.
It really struck me when you just kind of, you said it just kind of almost casually, but it kind of turned my world on its side kind of a little bit when you said that the first dairy farm, you know, we all have the version of the Judsons, you know, Phoebe Judson or whatever, but I'm very fascinated that the first dairy farm that was established in the Linden area was from a cross-cultural marriage. That's amazing. And you have to ask, was that just, why is the story different? Because it didn't look good to attribute it to a cross-cultural marriage, or what?
Yeah, well, the Judsons were a pretty fabulous couple.
Well, yeah, but they weren't.
But they weren't quite the
story's not
first.
really
Yeah.
true.
So, yeah,
And they weren't Dutch.
Elizabeth died. Elizabeth
That's
died of
decades
tuberculosis, which I believe was milk-borne tuberculosis because Mrs. Pfizer, Mrs. Emmerling, and Mrs. McClanahan all were working there, and they all died within a pretty short period of time. And I think it was the milk-borne bovine tuberculosis. So what happened then after Elizabeth died, then there's 2 little girls. And so Patterson already knew the Judsons. He used to keep his money in their safe clear down in Grand Mound where the Judsons had once lived. And the Roders recommended Mrs. Judson for fostering these 2 little girls. And so the little girls end up with the Judsons, but what's interesting is it's a singular document. There's nothing else like it. It's a guardianship paper filed with the auditor that has Phoebe, not Phoebe and Holden, but Phoebe taking those little girls until they're 18 and raising them as her own. And I always wonder, why not Holden? Well, Patterson wasn't looking for a new father for the girls. He was looking for a new mother, and he continued to come back and forth here. The farm had originally been a beef cattle operation to run beef up to the Caribou Gold Rush. And then as that petered out up there, then he turned to dairying and was selling butter and stuff, because you had these urban people like in Seattle and in what became Bellingham, Whatcom, and Seaholm, and the women were not making butter themselves. And the butter that was shipped in from California was usually rancid by the time it got here. So he was able to move his whole operation into being just dairying. And then the Judsons took that over, and Holden eventually got the whole works that Patterson had. Yeah.
Yeah, that's amazing. It's an unfortunate statement that one person made. Well, you don't think he really loved her, do you? You know,
Yeah.
That's a terrible thing to say when you don't have anything to base it on.
No, but we've been given a lot of myths over the years in literature, movies, history, the whole works, about the marginalized couple that lives on the edge of town because it's a cross-cultural couple and they don't contribute to the growth of the town. It's in all kinds of pulp fiction, westerns and stuff, and this native woman is just sort of a slave in the background.
Right.
Yeah, but
I
it's not
appreciate you bringing out a different story.
not necessarily true. Yeah, and I was a little surprised myself by how many accomplishments these women had. But the other thing was, people said there's nothing to find. Well, what took me so long, I did 9 years of just research, almost full time, was because there was so much to find, not so little. There was so much out there, but nobody'd ever bothered to look.
It's fun hearing the different connections you made between different characters that we associate with other things, you know.
Yeah.
You know, like, that's fun.
Yeah, that made it really fun. I could find ways to learn all kinds of wonderful stuff that my husband would go, "What does that book have to do with those women?" I'd like, "Oh, it does, right then, you know." I had to learn about the China trade with the big ships and everything, because that's what Fred Lane's family did. So,
Right.
yeah, I got to do that. Yeah. Is there another question? Yeah.
So, if this weekend I went to the Picket House for a little tour,
Yeah.
would I get a whitewash story, or have they embraced some of the information that you've brought forward?
Oh, yeah. Edradine and I have been working together for years, and they have a full update on it. Getting all the volunteers to read the updated information is another thing, you know, because it's about
It's a running chain.
60 pages long. But yeah, yeah,
Can you give them an abbreviated version to learn?
yeah. So
Mandatory reading for each and every volunteer.
yeah, so yes, Edradine knows all the updated stuff, and they're going to be selling my books over there too. I donate books to them to benefit the house.
Great.
Yeah, that is the oldest house on its original foundation in Washington State, and the only house left that Pickett lived in. So there are people from the East Coast that want to see that house because everything out there is gone. Yeah.
Wow.
Anything else? Yeah.
So did you have contact with Phil James?
Oh, he's been my mentor for 20 years. He and his mother. Yeah. And several other people. George Adams with Nooksack, and now he's teaching language down at Samish, is another one of my mentors. And Juanita Jefferson out there at Lummi. Yeah. Yeah, no, I would not have done this without mentors from the groups I was writing about. Yeah. And Bill had no problem saying, "Candy, you can't say that." So, Candy, that's none of your business, okay?
So that's where George Adams is teaching.
He's teaching language at Samish.
Because he was teaching it up here.
Yes.
He was for a
Yeah,
while
he's
here.
Nooksack, but
Yeah.
he's teaching down there.
Because he was actually using the Nooksack Indian Church to teach at.
Yeah.
For quite some time. Because
Yeah.
I'm involved over there.
Oh, yeah.
So, yeah. too bad he went down to Samish. It was really good having him there when he was teaching. I wondered what happened to him.
Yeah,
because
no, he's
he's
down
kind of
there.
disappeared.
Yeah, I did a program at, I think it was the Anacortes program, the Anacortes Library program. And to my great surprise, in comes George and about a half a dozen of the Samish, and they drummed and sang, and then he talked for a little while. And a sentence that he said is the beginning of my next book. Half histories are half truths, and half truths are lies.
Wow, that's a great statement.
Yeah.
That's great.
Good
Yeah.
challenge,
I think
see.
you should talk about the Skeksis dog since we're all
Oh, the,
meeting here.
what, the wool
How
dog?
you found it.
What time is it? You got time?
You've got time.
Okay, so in the midst of this project, I blundered into a scientific discovery. The Coast Salish people, including the Nooksack and others, had a little white dog called the Skehe, the Coast Salish wool dog. It's now extinct. And from the inner fur on these little dogs, they sheared them twice a year. And then this is what they wove the beautiful white blankets out of, along with mountain goat hair. And sometimes a little cat tail fluff would be in these blankets too. So I was working on the husband of Cecilia Kennerly Toby. And Kennerly, Caleb Burwell Rowan Kennerly was one of the highest trained doctors in the United States. And he came here with the boundary survey, and they just didn't have hardly any accidents. So he had a lot of free time. He was also employed by the new Smithsonian Institution as a naturalist to collect specimens and send them back. So he was the man who named the steelhead trout. And I think it has a different scientific name than it did when it was first called, Salmo Kennerlyi or something, and then it's later been changed. But he married Cecilia, whose family was at Semiahmoo. So when I was in Washington, D.C., I brought back home copies of 100 letters that he had written from here back to Spencer Baird, the head of the Smithsonian Institution. And he's writing about his days, but he's also writing about what he's sending back. And one of those letters said, I'm also sending Mutton, the wool dog. And it was George Gibbs's pet, but what had happened was Mutton had eaten the heads off the mountain goat specimens that they had, and he'd done it twice, and the Nooksack men were getting tired of hiking clear up into the mountains to bring back a whole family of mountain goats for his specimens. So he had said, we're going to make a specimen out of Mutton after he's sheared the next time. So that's what he did. And in the letter it said, Mutton is specimen number such and such, and there's a tag on the leg that says, this is the dog whose hair the Indian women used to make blankets. And he bundled it up and sent it back. This little dog, if you've seen what they call the American Eskimo dog, it's a little white dog with a tail, a Spitz type tail.
Yeah.
This dog looked very like that, but a little bit larger with a slightly different ear. Very cute dog. And they were kept on islands, or here in the Nooksack country, they were kept in pens. And they were purebred. It's the only purebred native North American dog that existed. And so the women, they were completely women's wealth and women's responsibility. And the women would go out to these little dog, they called them Dog Island. You see them around the Puget Sound, that's why they got that name, in flocks. And we think of it as packs, but when Captain George Vancouver saw them for the first time in 1792, I think, on Whidbey Island, he said, there's a flock of dogs out there. I thought they were sheep, but there were 40 of them together. And he said they're kept just like sheep. So
What was the native word for that?
it's called the Skehe, S-K-E-X-E, or Coast Salish wool dog. So
Katie, what?
S-K-E-X-E, Skehe, or Coast Salish wool dog. So all the anthropologists and archaeologists always said no specimen was ever collected of this extinct dog. We don't really know what it looked like. So I'm got that letter, but I just sort of go over it. And then one night I wake up like at 3 in the morning and I'm going, wait a minute. You made the assumption that the mice ate it 100 years ago. And so I got up in the morning at 6 and I wrote a letter to the curator of mammals at the Smithsonian. And I said, any chance specimen number 406, the Coast Salish wool dog, is still there, and it's got a name tag, it's got this tag on its leg. And so the curator wrote back like an hour later and he says, oh, it's in the catalog. And I just sort of sat there and I was like, this is impossible, I'm a housewife. How could I have found something the anthropologists and archaeologists couldn't find themselves?
Because you took the time to do it.
Yeah.
Because you're a woman.
And a housewife. Yeah. So
They won't ask for directions.
So, yeah, I wrote back to him and I said, wait a minute. I said, this is really important to the Native women out here because they've never been able to see what their great-grandmothers wove with. They've only been able to guess at it because nobody's ever seen one of these dogs. And so he wrote back and he said, okay, I'm going out to the research facility and I'm going to see. And then he comes back and writes and he said, oh yeah, mutton's in the drawer. He said he's still got that tag hanging on his leg. So I'm just kind of sitting there. So one of my other mentors was Dr. Wayne Suttles, who is now passed on, eminent anthropologist of the Coast Salish people. So I called Dr. Suttles and I said, this thing has sort of happened. What do I do now? And he said, well, first of all, you don't tell anybody because you want credit for finding it. And then he said, we need measurements, we need photographs. And so I wrote back to the curator and I said, this is what we need. And he said, well, we're talking about this and we could do this for you, but we think you should come and do it yourself. Because they were getting kind of caught up into this weird housewife story. So 3 weeks later, I'm on the airplane and I go out there and I spent all day long. The dog had never been tanned, so a 150-year-old dead dog. And I am measuring it and photographing it, and I ended up just smelling horrible. But before I went, I thought, they all think I'm just a housewife. They don't realize that I have a couple of degrees. I know what research is. But I'm just going to play housewife. So I said, any chance that I could bring a piece of it back with me so the women can see? And I knew full well the Smithsonian is not in the business of cutting up their specimens. So about a day later he writes, he said, well, we took it to committee and we've decided you can have a piece of it. If you have a facility with the proper storage and that has a public education program and people can come in and see it for themselves. So when I was done with the day, I spent the whole day with the curator out there, and he let me look at anything I wanted. So I've been up to here in giant panda fur. And I saw Teddy Roosevelt's elephant skull, the real one, with the bullet hole in here. It was just, really a cool thing. So at the end of the day, he brings out a hacksaw, and he says, where would you like the piece from? So I said, it's got 4 different kinds of hair on it, up to 9 inches long, and the part that was spun into yarn is kind of like a cotton ball, and it's way on the inside. It's an insulating layer, and the rest is kind of silky, and there's guard hair. So I said, I want all 4 kinds of hair. So he took a piece off the flank, kind of the edge of the stomach, about this big, and put it in a box, and I rode home on the plane, and I'm going, oh, please don't crash, please don't crash. We'll never have this opportunity again, and I just sat there with it on my lap and brought it home. And so now the Smithsonian is using mutton's fur to authenticate the Coast Salish blankets that they have in their collections, because always before the labels on the displays said might have dog hair in it. And now they have authenticated them so that they can change everything. And I heard recently that the Burke Museum used some of it on their blankets, and they actually mentioned my name as the discoverer. Yeah. So, but just a complete accidental thing that I got to do. Oh, and then like 6 months later, when the Indian Museum opened up, there were 2 groups kind of with their backs to each other at a cocktail party. and the Museum of Natural History people were talking about my discovery, and the people with their backs to them were from the Indian Museum, and they were from the fabric lab. And they turned around and said, "What are you talking about?" And they told them, and that's how they got the fur to authenticate, because the museums don't talk to each other.
Of course not.
Of course not. But then they called me and said, "We're kind of fascinated. How would you like to come out and see what we do at the Museum of the American Indian and spend the day with us?" So I got to go back, and I got to go to the research facility, and they let me look at anything I wanted to look at, from the tip of South America to the Aleutian Islands, all the artifacts that they have. And
Wow,
yeah, so great perk for my project.
great story.
Yeah.
Great story.
And Kennerly and his wife did not make it into either book. They were one of the eliminated couples.
So what'd you do with the sample?
Yeah,
It's
what
at
would you
Waka
do?
Museum.
That's what I
What-
thought.
yeah.
However,
Yeah.
I was photographing on a big piece of black fabric, because he's white. And so at the end of the day, I just took the edges like this, because a whole bunch of fur had fallen out.
Oh, yeah.
And I rolled it up, and so I have my own stash now.
And it's in your will.
Yeah. I better
Gotta go
think about
someplace.
doing that, hadn't
You
I?
don't want somebody cleaning your drawers.
Exactly, and just
Oh,
tossing it
Oh,
out.
it's your favorite pet.
I know, yeah, yeah.
And, yeah.
Yeah, this little dog was supposed to have gone extinct in the 1860s. That's what everybody wrote, because the settlers came in, the dogs started mixing with settlers' dogs and Hudson Bay Company dogs. And the women, once the sheep were here, the women saw that this was way easier than the intense labor involved in paddling out to an island every morning and feeding the dogs. So the dogs were supposed to have disappeared. However, I have a newspaper article from Canada in the 1922 in which a forest ranger guy saw a pack of them on an island off the northern tip of Vancouver Island. And I saw a photograph online from a Lummi Weaver, and it's of her grandmother. And she's sitting with her blanket. That's what the picture's supposed to be, and sitting right beside her is one of these dogs. So I don't think there's another photo anywhere of this dog. And I knew what it was immediately, because the little ears on these dogs were a perfect triangle, 3 centimeters on a side. All the other dogs, it's more like this. But this was perfect little triangle, and I looked at it and I was like, oh my God, there it is. There, it was immediately recognizable. Yeah. I'd love to be able to publish that picture, but I don't really dare ask, because it's family. You know what I mean. Yeah, it's a family possession. So,
Do you have a copy of it for yourself?
of the picture, I probably could have taken a screenshot, off the computer.
Your
Could I have done that on Facebook? I could have taken a screenshot. So all I have to do is go back to that group and then scroll back 3 or 4 months and. But it's kind of theft of intellectual property, so I probably won't do that without permission. Yeah. So any other questions, comments? I'm very
That's really
grateful you
good.
guys all came tonight.
Thank you. Yeah, it was very
Thank you.
interesting.
Good for WSU. Volume 2.
Oh, yeah. Yes, I'm very fortunate that WSU Press wanted to publish this book, and they asked for the second group of biographies, and we'll publish that in March. And it's an honor that they have chosen to publish my work.
Well done, well done.
You're like one of those Indian ladies, nobody thinks anything, you're just a housewife, and look what you did.
Yeah, exactly.
I was a well-educated housewife, but I moved all over the country with my husband. I never, worked as anything important. And I started volunteering at the state archives.
That's where it all began.
And I did that for 15 years. So if any of you came back in the 2000s to do genealogy in there, you may have run into me. Yeah. So,
Interesting.
but you never know where things are going to lead you. So.
Very good.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.